Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the new album from LMNO, titled Preparanoia. So okay, last year I received a request to review a hip-hop album from a rapper that I'd never heard of before, and yet managed to turn out one of my favorite albums of last year, thanks to great, well-structured bars and phenomenal production from a guest producer who I've already covered twice thus far this year. And that producer was Evidence, and the album was called After the Fact by the prolific, highly skilled, and impressively monotone MC LMNO. And you know what? Over the past year, I've begun to see more and more why LMNO has managed to carve out his niche so defiantly outside of mainstream rap. Not only does he produce new material at a rather impressive rate, not counting 2010 where he released 10 albums worth of material in 1 year, but his delivery was icy, crisp, multisyllabic, and near devoid of any sort of inflection or real drama. He was the sort of rapper who could deliver bars of well-structured material until the end of time, although his flat brand of intensity could be a little bit difficult to tolerate for some listeners. But you know what, even with that, I really do respect his wordplay and his creativity. And while it was a little bit disheartening to see him part ways with Evidence for his newest album, Preparanoia, I still took the time to check it out regardless. He's a good enough rapper, I owed him that much. So, what'd I find? Well, both more and less than I was expecting. On the one hand, Preparanoia by LMNO lives exactly up to the promise of its title. A paranoid record where LMNO tersely spits out the hard truth, even though he fears who might be listening to him, or fears even more who isn't listening to him. But on the other hand, it's also a disjointed, unfocused album that flits from idea to idea and frequently feels like it leaves many of them unfinished or undercooked. In other words, I would not call it as good of an album as After the Fact, but it's still an interesting hip-hop album for this year, and it is still definitely worth a listen. So let's start with LMNO himself. And look, if you're a fan of his methodical, slow-flow, multi-syllabic rhymes, nothing's really changed to that. He's the sort of rapper that requires multiple listens because his voice doesn't so much draw attention, but requires that you step up and engage with it, which can definitely be an acquired taste for those people who are just listening to get their bars right out of the gate. I will say, to LMNO's credit, he seems to have amped up a little bit more of his investment in his material, showing more energy and visceral presence behind the microphone than on previous albums, and his methodical tone does a lot for the whole conspiratorial atmosphere that this record seems to be trying to make, and which makes his statement seem marginally more plausible. Now that being said, even when you are paying attention to LMNO's flow and his delivery, they can start to run together a little bit. And considering nobody's bothered to post his lyrics anywhere online, there are points where his lyricism seems to be spinning its wheels, at least when it comes to breaking it down and analyzing it without having the lyrics right in front of me. Now this is where we have to start asking the big questions. Namely, what the hell is this album about beyond paranoid conspiracy ramblings? Honestly, it gets a little bit hard to tell because LMNO has long had a taste for very intricate wordplay and veiling his message in a lot of layered poetry, which when combined with the conspiratorial tone of the instrumentation can start stretching one's patience. I mean, if you're trying to speak the truth, why spend so much time talking around the truth instead of just getting to the point? Now, the best moments on this album are when LMNO is being refreshingly straightforward and exposing his targets, mostly political corruption, corrupt businesses, and shallow pop rappers who prop up the broken system. Take Breakaways, for instance. It's a terrific takedown to the last group, casting LMNO and collaborator Mr. Brady as vegetarians in a butcher shop, figures outside of the meat market of the industry that grinds up its stars in a hamburger when they're done with them. And yet it's a meat market that's got its own temptations, which comes up on Last Long, where LMNO acknowledges that his own very different view of artistic success that's very separate from the monetary fortune that could come if he choose to embrace pop rap, one that could just be as fulfilling. Now that, if anything, seems to be the underlying motivation of this album. The secret is that if rappers chose to talk about real things that actually mattered, the industry built on flash and not longevity would collapse impotently around them. And yet, despite the paranoid urgency that colors this album, LMNO seems quite aware that his method, doing things on his own, holding to his own brand of artistic integrity, and yet while never reaching the same commercial heights, is still doing doing quite well for himself, and he's aware that it's working fine for him. In other words, it's not all his paranoia on this album that he's stressing, but it's more of the industry's. And if you're all thinking that this is also reminiscent of The Roots' most recent album, And Then You Shoot Your Cousin, or Open Mike Eagle's album, Dark Comedy, well, you wouldn't be far from the truth. However, this is where framing starts to become the issue, because LMNO is very much aware that he's operating in his own lane. He's very comfortable with it. And yet, without the empathetic delivery of Open Mike Eagle or the sheer bombast of The Roots' last record, LMNO's criticism on the industry can lack a certain amount of emotional investment. It's telling that when he goes after larger societal targets, his rhymes happen to have a little bit more punch and are a little bit more relevance. But the shorter track length and LMNO's tendency to not be direct means many of its ideas on this album feel very thinly sketched, which is the last thing you want to happen when you try to go political. And given that the political tracks are framed with a certain amount of hushed conspiratorial atmosphere, I gotta admit, it can get a little bit hard for me to take it very seriously, even if I really do support the messages that are coming up beneath them. Now, granted, some of that issue might be linked to the instrumentation and the production, as a mix of sample-heavy boom-bap with thick, textured beats, scratching, and almost industrial fuzz at points. Now, there are definitely beats and instrumental moments that I really do like on this album. I like the heavy rumble of Go balanced out against the strings, the washed-out keyboards and guitars on Who, the massive wall of distortion on Research, the grimy darkness of I Write and Now. There's some really good production on this record, reminiscent and creating this old-school vibe, very reminiscent of someone like Madlib if he was working with a lot drearier material. But this creates a twofold problem. The first is, given the uniformity of the production, you run into points where some songs start sounding extremely similar to each other and not really building their own unique, distinct identities, especially melodically. And the second issue is tone. If you're going to soundtrack your album with the sort of sleazy music that would play in the back of a cheap VHS 90s thriller you find in the bargain basement, it becomes harder to take your political statements remotely seriously, especially when the very grim tone of this album doesn't really switch up all that much. The frustrating thing is that it really does fit LMNO's delivery as an MC really quite well, but at the same time it reflects his problems, where neither he or the instrumentation evolve or change up enough to escalate or press a real point to drive home that emphasis, and that means this album, it can start feeling a little bit monotone to match its rapper. And while it ultimately means that this record, while being a very good album in LMNO's discography, it doesn't end up doing a whole lot for me. Now, there's still plenty of great wordplay, and every time that I listen to this album, I find more elements to really like about it, especially lyrically, which is definitely the mark of a rapper that I really can respect. But at the same time, Preparanoia, it's a bleak, meandering album that can feel like it repeats itself and never really makes a direct point beyond some broad political shots and some shots at cheap pop rap. So you know what? I'm gonna give this album a light 7 out of 10 and a recommendation, especially if you're into this brand of backpacker rap. And I mean that as a qualifier, not a slam. But it's also one of those albums that does require a certain amount of very real patience to really take it in. Now, thankfully, it's often worth it. So go ahead, give it a look. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or if there's any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.